Hello, my name is Daniel Yuck. Thank you for watching. I appreciate you, your time, and your support. In today's video, I want to dive into part 2 of this two-part stipple series that I'm putting together for you here. On part 2, I'm going to be leaving a link for this chart right here so you can download it on your end, place it down, and follow along with me. Now, if you have any questions at any point throughout this video, I'm also going to encourage you to drop a comment down below. I'll do my absolute best to assist you in the best possible direction. Please don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel and ring that bell for me, as I will be bringing more videos like this for you. I do also have social medias under the same name as my YouTube. I have Facebook, Instagram, X, and TikTok, all under Daniel Yuck. I would appreciate the support over there as well. With that being said, let's get right on into this. Here is the Stipple fundamental follow along chart. You can see that we have a small assortment of various squares, and these squares are going to be little practices and points that we're going to go over here in this video. Allow me to kind of go over here before we jump into the technical aspect. You can see this square right here says consistent strokes, in which I will explain more about consistent strokes so that way we can see what those look like. You can see inconsistent strokes right here. That's going to go right there. Dots spaced evenly, and you can see dots spaced unevenly. You can see right here we do also have some cross hatching, needle introduction, and a different needle. So this is going to be a chart that represents the different results that we get for each of these labels. So for consistent strokes, we could take a look at this square and get an idea of what consistent strokes kind of should look like. You kind of get the idea with that. If you are new to tattooing and you don't have a printer or haven't even started, feel free to just screenshot the end result so that way you can have that for reference should you need it later. Once again, the link will be for you down below so you can download this chart, place it down to follow along with me. I do encourage you to follow along so that way you can get an idea as to what it kind of feels like to create your consistent strokes, your inconsistent strokes, your dots spaced evenly, unevenly. You get the idea. We're all going to have a sort of different approach and workflow, so I feel like this is a great step to help us kind of get more acquainted with what is comfortable to us and what isn't. So in part 1, I went over all of these individual variables and I demonstrated them. Part 2, we're going to be doing them together here so that way we can get an even better understanding. The stencil right here also does come in multiple sizes, so pick the one that's right for you. I just went with the biggest size that I left available on this stencil. That's the size that I'm using, but if you use any one, you can still get the points across. I'm going to start with the consistent strokes. Now, much like in part 1, I was demonstrating what consistent strokes look like. One thing or a couple of variables that we're going to want to be mindful of are not only the speed that we're using, but the spacing that we're using in between. The speed is essentially going to determine the spacing in between each dot, and how far we space each line is basically going to determine how smooth it is, because if we're making the lines too spread apart, then we're going to see those little patches there. So we want to be considerate of our movements here, and we want to try to be as consistent as we can on those two fronts. We want to match our hand speed to our voltage, and we also want to be mindful of the actual shading placement. So consistent strokes would look something similar to this. So basically this is going to be like my darkest point right here, an imaginary line right here, if you get what I'm saying. So that's going to be my darkest point, and then from here what I'm going to do is find a healthy medium that I feel comfortable with. As you can see, my spacing is nice and clean, and my pixels are coming out very close to one another. Although they may not be identical, that's perfectly okay. You can see that was a little too far apart. And you can see what I mean when the spacing is a little bit too far apart, and it shows and it stands out like a sore thumb. And I'm essentially going to do this all the way across, and you're going to want to follow along with me and try to do this. I'm running at 5 volts because that's typically where I shade. I like to layer up my shading, which we're also going to try here in a moment, and to get to the points that I'm trying to get to. So you can see here though, after the first pass, that we are getting a sort of consistency here. So the shadings are lining up, the spacing is nice and clean between each one. Although again, it's not perfect, this is a great foundation to build off of. From here, what I can do is I keep applying these layers to accomplish the shading that I want. So for example, you see how we have some spaces in between here. What I can do is use a little bit of cross hatching, which is another thing that we're going to practice. And I'm just going to help me define this point a little bit more. like so. And then I'm going to go ahead and add another layer of consistent strokes going down right here. And then we're going to kind of build up until we get to the layers that we are happy with. So you can see on the second layer, I was able to pick up my pace a little bit because now I'm starting to build layers. However, we can see that I'm still getting a sort of consistency. Now this is the pathway, I suppose. This is the path to take to get clean, consistent strokes. When we're done, they should read like a nice, clean read here. And you can see that I'm just simply taking my time. I'm also using Mummy just triple black tattooing ink to get my points across here. And you can see that my strokes are now getting longer here. And they're still neighboring one another. So that right there is a clear indication of consistent strokes. We are going to look at what inconsistent strokes look like here in a moment. But let's go ahead and get through this exercise right here first. So you can see I'm just using a basic sort of whip motion out towards me. Let me actually clean that up there. And I'm not sure if you're able to see it real time since it is a little time consuming to kind of layer up shades, but it is coming out nice and clean because of that mindfulness. Again, because I'm mindful of each pixel in between my dots and the spacing in between each line. Those are two super important variables that I am considering here. And you can see even when the ink's fresh, it does look pretty consistent. We don't get like any sparsities. There's not like any harsh lines, and it's coming out smooth here. And then all I'm doing is just a little bit of cross hatching, which I'm going to talk more about here in a moment. But I do want to add a little bit just to provide a little bit more smoothness. Now I'm going to leave this process real time so that way you can see that layering up to a smoother approach may be more beneficial, especially if you're going for clean, smoother shades. I'm going to go ahead and do just maybe one or two more passes over this area so that way we can kind of move on to the next phase here. So I'm going to just do clean, consistent strokes again, all the way across, keeping my pixels evenly spaced as well as each individual stroke as well. So I'm worrying about my dot spacing and my stroke spacing. And I'm using the smooth side of True Skin here. So depending on the fake skin that you were using would really determine how quickly this is going to go by. So you can see my strokes here are still consistent even though they're back and forth, almost pendulum-like. I'm going to clean this off, see what we have. And you can see though, this is essentially the end result for consistent strokes. If I want to smooth things out, I can do a little bit of cross hatching. However, I'm going to leave it like that so that way we can demonstrate that consistent stroke. You could see that I did use an assorted number of different strokes here to accomplish this smooth shade right here. Now, I want to move on over to what inconsistent strokes can look like. It's going to be important to know the difference between the inconsistent strokes and the consistent strokes. So you can see even with the consistent strokes, we get a nice clean shading there. Keep in mind, that's just majority downwards whip motions. There's no cross hatching or anything to smooth this out, and we're already getting a smooth read. That is how we know we are producing consistent strokes. So from here, I'm going to go ahead and navigate on over to the next square, and I'm going to demonstrate what inconsistent strokes look like. So keep in mind, with consistent strokes, we're worried about the dot spacing and the stroke spacing. So you can kind of imagine inconsistent strokes would be the opposite of that, where we have uneven dots and uneven spaces. So let me go ahead and demonstrate. What I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to change my hand speed voltage, and I'm also going to have to not be so mindful of the spaces in between my shades. So you can see that I'm moving at a faster hand speed and my spacing is more sparse and sporadic. That is the first layer. In comparison to the other layer with consistent strokes, this one is tremendously more patchier. This is where we start getting that sort of blotchy, sort of inconsistent appearance. I'm going to go ahead and do this again. So I'm going to start off fast, and then I'm going to go slow, and then I'm going to go fast again, and then I'm going to go slow and then fast again. And which I've seen before. I've seen this technique be used on shading, and then the shading looks like that. So you can see here that this area is getting a little bit more darker while these are lighter. Now, not only are my dots not spaced correctly, but you can see my strokes are also far apart, which means I would have to go right here, add a stroke, right here, add a stroke, right here. And you get the idea. I'm going to have to essentially repeat this where there isn't enough strokes there. And you can see it kind of just starts building up. So inconsistent strokes are just unaligning our hand speed and our voltage and our stroke motions. So if I were to kind of just repeat, let me go ahead and kind of just repeat the process of inconsistent strokes here. And I'm going to kind of do it with the same sort of motions where I'm starting from the top and then working my way to the bottom, or whipping my way to the bottom there. And I'm going to go over just a few times to kind of layer it up. I'm going to do different techniques where I'm going to start slower, and then I can go ahead and go a little bit quicker, like so, and then repeat. But you can see though that not only does the application not look correct, you can see the results that I'm getting aren't correct either. And then you can see like, and I've actually seen this sort of technique again be used, which is pretty, I guess, intense for me, although it does provide a sort of shade. When we take a closer look at it, it's a little bit more sparse, sporadic, and consistent. Some dots are a little bit more darker down here when the dark should be up here. You get the idea. And then if I'm doing inconsistent strokes, let me show you how we can produce patchier results. So you can see just with those strokes right there, I'm starting to produce very patchy results. And let's just say that if I continue down this road, the results that I'm going to get with this specific square right here, this specific box, are going to be a lot less inconsistent than the one on the left. Now, I know at a far glance this may kind of look like shading, but this isn't necessarily the way that I would want to go about applying my shading. I would want my shading to read nice, clean, and consistent as I possibly can. The only time I speed up my hand, the way you see me doing it like this, is when I've already applied multiple layers of shading. So for example, you can see with the consistent strokes, if I wanted to go over again, what I can do is I'd be able to get away with moving like that and bringing the shading out a little bit more, because I've already have a base layer that I'm working off of. So you can see that these sparse and sporadic dots aren't taking away from the shading, they're only complementing what's already existing. I can go ahead and do that one more time. So you can see that even though the hand speed used to apply that was faster than the original, my motions were still consistent. I was still getting a nice clean read. So depending on where we're using these techniques is really going to matter. If we're starting straight off and straight away with this sort of technique as you see me doing here, then we may be more prone to blotchy, inconsistent results, which is what this pretty much looks like right here. Let me go ahead and do this one last time, and then we can kind of move on to the next. You can see that I'm going to move slower now. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not worried about the spacing or my pixels or anything like that. And there we go. So those are the results that we got. And again, keep in mind, at a distance, this may look like a gradient. However, when we get close up, we can kind of really see all the imperfections. Here's a closer view real quick. And I am going to give you a top view when we're done with all of this so that we can screenshot and see everything. However, you can see though that this transition, this gradient is a lot more smoother, saturated, and cleaner than this one right here. This gradient really doesn't have a nice transitional gradient like this one right here because of these spots right here. It looks a little bit blotchy, and we can see that this is a direct side effect from inconsistent, whether it's going to be the pixel placement or the line stroke placement. One of them are going to be off, and this is essentially what it's going to look like. Every artist is going to yield different results, some better, some worse. You get the idea behind the logic though. Let's talk about the dots pixels being spaced evenly. And as I mentioned with the consistent strokes, this is also a big variable that we're going to want to pay attention to. We must have our dots spaced evenly. Let's say when we're laying down the shading, this is especially crucial. Once we have our shades and once it's almost locked in, we can use more sparse and sporadic motions and techniques to apply some dots in areas where we need more fainter dots. But for dots spaced evenly, one thing that I'm going to be mindful of is the motion that I start with. So for example, you can see how my dots are spaced like this. I kind of want to mimic that as best I can all the way across until I've reached the point of the canvas where it's done over here on the end. Forgive me there. Still focused on my dot placement. You can see though that a lot of these dots are lining up to the neighboring lines. Now with this sort of approach, we should start getting a nice clean gradient transition. As long as we keep spacing our dots evenly as well as our strokes, then there's no issue in terms of getting a smooth shade, or there shouldn't be really, so to speak. I'm going to go ahead and repeat here. So dot spaced evenly is going to look like this. Let me get some more ink here. So that's the first line, and granted, they're not always perfect, but you're going to notice that they are pretty darn close, and that's what you want to go for. You just want to try to get it as close as you can. And you can see how I'll kind of move a little bit too far over, but I'll go back and touch areas up. Okay, that one's a little too spaced apart, and I'm going to touch base on that a little bit more. And then right here we're just going to do just quick motions to kind of fill that area out. And you can see though, off the bat, with the technical application when we're doing it correct versus incorrect, we can see even the application, the way it physically looks is completely different. You know, it is night and day. Now, this is going to be the boundary right here. So I'm going to kind of do the same thing that we did on the other one, where I kind of just define this point right here. So you can see like that. And then I'm going to go ahead and keep creating my shade off of this area here. Now I'm going to keep going where my dots are spaced evenly, but you can see how smooth and clean this is looking. This right here looks a lot cleaner close up than this does right here. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that this technique is bad right here, but what I am saying is that this is something that I would rather go for, this sort of read right here. So again, remember, keep in mind, I'm focused on the dots, each individual dot right here. I'm not focused on the spacing in between the lines, or in between the dots. I'm focused on the dot spacing itself. And you can see I'm bringing out these motions a little bit more. Now there are inconsistencies within my strokes, you're going to notice that. However, if they're still close and neighboring one another, then in the macro, when we're done, we're not going to be able to tell how far off we are. So if we're doing a good enough job, then we should be yielding smooth, clean results. Let me go ahead and do this a couple of more times here so that we can get a little bit darker of a tone. And keep in mind, we're still working on dots being spaced evenly. And you can see that even this area, there's no cross hatching involved, but we have almost this entire area filled up and reading as a whole, which is great. And I'm just using the very tip of the needle. I'm not like asserting any sort of unnecessary pressure or even pressure at all. I'm just kind of letting the needle do the work for me. If I wanted, I can lightly go over this area just a little bit. You can see I moved my hand speed, or I picked up my hand speed there just to do a light layer. And that right there is a direct side effect from dots being spaced evenly. We start getting a clean tone. And if I wanted to clean this area up, again, what I would do is just do a little bit of cross hatching. And you can see even going right and left, my motions remain consistent, yielding clean results. Let me go ahead and do this one more time. And keep in mind, I'm moving a bit faster because I already have the shading foundation laid out. And that right there is how I would go about smoothing out. And you kind of repeat that cross-hatching process as needed. But you can see this right here is a direct result from spacing out and being mindful of the dot spacing. You can see that we are getting nice, clean transitions and gradients, and that is what you want to get. That is what contributes to that sort of smooth read. That's what people and onlookers who look at the designs would interpret as smooth. Okay, so I feel like that was a good place to end that one right there. Let me go ahead and show you the results. So you can see even with these three right here, being mindful of the dots spacing and the consistent strokes is going to yield far better results. You can see that when we're not mindful of these small variables, then we're more prone to making blotchy mistakes like this. Again, this isn't necessarily wrong. I feel like this sort of approach is going to be better when we're looking for textures or we need to texturize certain parts of a design. I don't feel like this should be the whole way that we approach shading. I feel like this is better for a mass sort of shading where we're going to be shading dominantly certain areas of a design would be with these. If we need to add textures to certain areas, I would go with this one. Now, when it comes to dots being spaced unevenly, I hope by now we can kind of anticipate some results. We are going to be getting inconsistent blotchiness. That is definitely going to appear very similar to the inconsistent strokes. So when the dots aren't spaced evenly, that's basically contributing to the hand speed. So let's say if I move around this hand speed here, but this one I move slower, and this one faster and slower, faster, slower. And you can see my stroke length is also wrong, because you can see how it's changing. And none of these strokes ever came out to the same length here. So you can see how even the aftermath here, that there's no consistency within these dot spacings. There's no read going on there. If I wipe away, we're gonna get kind of just this right here. Let me do a little bit better of a job to clean that up. So you can see that's what we are working with essentially. Allow me to kind of repeat so you can see. If I'm not mindful of the spacing in between, and this is a really like extreme example, hopefully no one ever does it like this, but you can see though that it's still going to yield inconsistent results. There's not even a sort of like gradient going on here. We're just kind of adding dots at this point. Now keep in mind the only reason why it's darker right here is because that's where I'm touching down and going from. So that's where I touch down is always going to be the darkest point. If I slow it down and I go faster, you can kind of see the idea though that uneven dot spacing is going to negatively impact this here. Let's go ahead and Now even in my strokes, that one I was kind of consistent with all of the stroke motions there. So like again, if I go fast, slow. So you can see though, even my physical technique doesn't look right. Something looks off. And if you ever see that, then you may know that the artist's technical application is not correct. They may still be working through it. You get the idea. But that right there is a direct result of dots being spaced unevenly. There's no sort of like cohesive read. There's no sort of consistency. If we pay attention, we can see all of these little gaps in between right here. And none of this area right here causes a sort of transition or a gradient. So right here off the bat, again, there are a few problems. If we're looking for smooth shading, we're not going to get it with this sort of approach. If we're trying to texturize a certain area, then this may be more a dominant approach to go with. But again, it's really going to determine what we are going for. Since we are focused on smooth stipple shading for this two-part series, that's basically what I am referring to as these are the correct ways to go about smooth stipple shading as opposed to these for this video. Again, none of them are wrong though. It really is going to come down to what you need from your shading. Those textures, if you're needing that, then you may know how to approach that a little bit better with a more sparse, sporadic approach. If you're needing smooth shading, then you're definitely going to want to remain consistent and away from sparse or sporadic. Now, I'm going to move on to cross hatching. If we aren't familiar with cross hatching, it's essentially layering shading in different directions to create a smoother shade. So let me demonstrate that. I'm going to kind of approach it the same way that we have been, where I use downward whip motions right here. I'm going to kind of create the foundation. And you can see how I'm moving towards me, which are downward strokes with a whip out motion. Now cross hatching is essentially going to be applying lines in a similar manner, but instead going in this direction. So let me go ahead and clean this off a little bit to give us a better idea. And then from here, I'm going to go back and forth. And then cross hatching, you can see how I'm using back and forth motions to go over the area that we just started applying. And this can help us tremendously smooth out our shading. This can help us extend our shading out if we need to. So you can see that even after the second pass, it's already getting a sort of smooth look to it. Just a little bit at the end there. And then again, I'm going to go ahead and go over with some more cross hatching. So let's say I want to darken this area right here. I'm going to do that. And keep in mind, this entire demonstration, I'm just running at 5 volts. I'm not going to change the voltage. Right and left, overlapping the dots, making sure I get wall to wall as best I can. And then I'm going to dab right there, wipe away. And that is essentially cross hatching in a nutshell. And keep in mind, it doesn't only have to be up, down, or right and left either. Let's say, for example, if I'm needing to cross hatch in this direction, like if I need to go this way, I can cross hatch in that direction. We just want to, again, be mindful of the dot spacing, the stroke spacing, those little things that we're going over. Once we start adding all of those variables and aligning them, we should be yielding cleaner, smoother results. Forgive me for that. But you can see though that cross hatching doesn't necessarily need to be right or left. It can be like this at an angle like that. So that's going to be subjective. You kind of have to determine what you are needing. Go ahead and go over it here. And then I'm going to do this one last time where we go back and forth this way. That right there though is cross hatching. And this can be great for multiple things. Again, if you need to smoothen something out, if you need to extend your shading, make it look more natural and cleaner, then cross hatching could definitely save that. So you can see right there though that it does look like I was just using whip motions. However, I was shading in multiple directions. One important thing with cross hatching to remember is that you shouldn't be able to tell the directions that you are shading in. That's not something that you want to be seen off the bat. So you want to be mindful of your pressure that you're using, as we went over in part 1. So don't put too much pressure. You just want to, have a natural flow, which you will develop into when you are applying your shading, like so. I'm gonna go ahead and dab, wipe away, and that right there is a result of cross hatching. Let's get into needle introduction. This one's actually really important. Now, this isn't something that I understood off the bat. When I first started, I kind of limited myself to shading where I had to start from one edge and then work off of that edge. I wasn't really comfortable with shading that didn't have any sort of starting definitive end or starting points. So shadings that kind of were over areas that I couldn't tell where they started or stopped made me a little bit nervous, and that's where I kind of dug more into needle introduction and the way that my needle is introduced to the skin. So let me demonstrate. You can see with, for example, the cross hatching, how when I introduced the needle to the skin, I started right here and then I whipped out. So this area right here got to see more needle. The needle was introduced and then it whipped out. You can kind of get the idea behind that. Now, that is going to leave me with darker results where the needle was introduced. Whenever I touch down the needle like this and then I kind of whip out, that's because I'm trying to make this area more darker. What if I'm not? What if I need to shade without making the area or a specific area dark? That's where the introduction comes into play. So what that means is when we introduce the needle, much like I mentioned in part 1, how we kind of want to have it in a sort of pendulum motion is going to be important. So if I kind of introduce it like so and then bring it out, then we're not going to be able to tell where the start point and end point are. So let me show you here. So I'm going to kind of make sure that I'm comfortable right here, and then I'm going to taper in, so to speak, and then taper out, going back and forth. And this is going to produce a shade, but it's going to produce a shade with no definitive starting or ending points. You're not going to be able to tell which side is which, and that right there is essentially introduction of needle into skin. I'm not introducing the needle right here and tapering out this way because it's going to leave a harsh starting black point right here, as opposed to a smooth finish on both sides. So you can see the introduction, I'm tapering in, needle catches, so like that. And then again, you still want to be mindful of your dot spacing as well as your stroke spacing to get clean, consistent reads there. But you're going to notice that even when I wipe away from here, that there shouldn't be any definitive starting and ending points if this is applied correctly. You can see that that's how we're introducing. You can see both sides have sort of fade whips there. I'm going to go ahead and wipe away to see what this is looking like. So that's exactly what I meant. This shade right here has no harsh definitive starting points or end points. There's a fade going on here, another fade going on here with some tones right here. So that right there is the importance of needle introduction. We're definitely going to need to be able to introduce our needle in multiple manners when we are tattooing, and not just in one sort of whip motion. This isn't something that I picked up early on. This is kind of what made shading a little bit more difficult for me early on, is understanding how I was going to introduce the needle to the skin so that way I don't leave harsh starting points. Let me go ahead and demonstrate that a little bit more here, and you kind of follow along with me. I kind of just want to go up to this part of the square here. So introduction, mindful of my pixel spacing as well as my stroke spacing. back and forth motions. Keep my hand speed relatively the same as I possibly can. And you can tell, even laying down the ink right here, that there is no harsh starting points or end points. You can see that the needle is being introduced lightly to both sides, but I'm accomplishing saturation right here in the middle. This is going to be great to master and get comfortable with, because this is what we would essentially be using to smoothen things out. Now let me wipe this away. And this is going to essentially be repeated until you reach the gradient that you're happy with. So I can kind of just go over it one more time to get a little bit darker up here, but you can see that there's still no harsh starting or ending points, and that's exactly what we want. We want to be able to introduce the needle like this, so that way we can use this sort of technique when need be, and I assure you we are going to need this technique. So just be mindful of your needle introduction. And even here, cross hatching could also come into play, where if I wanted, I can do cross hatching like this. Like that. Again, just to smoothen things out. But that right there is exactly what needle introduction is. As you can see, as I mentioned, there is no definitive starting points or ending points. There is a shade right here, and then there's two fade outs right there. Let's go ahead and move on to different needle. I'm going to be using the Josie 7-round shader that we did use on part 1 here. I'm still going to be running at 5 volts as well, and I'm going to do everything the same, but you're going to see that the techniques that I'm explaining here in this video can be applied to essentially any needle that we choose to use. We're just going to have to kind of compensate and adjust a little bit in correspondence to the needle that we're using, as I mentioned in part 1. But you're going to see that we still should be getting clean, consistent, smooth results with any needle that we choose, as long as we're aligning the correct fundamentals. So we have the consistent strokes to worry about, the dot spaced evenly, we have the cross hatching, as well as the needle introduction. Before here, I'm just going to go ahead and do whip shading from here on down. So I'm going to go ahead and start right here. Still running at 5 volts. But this time I'm using a 7-round shader. Being mindful of each pixel, you can see that they're going in really well, complementing the neighboring stroke well. I'm going to go ahead and dab and see where we are at. And I'm going to repeat. Just like so. So you can kind of see though that these fundamentals are essentially universal, and it's going to be the same thing for pretty much any needle that we choose. It doesn't really matter if we're using round shaders, round liners, mags. The approach is essentially going to be the same. I encourage you to also find like different voltages that you're comfortable using with different needles. Every needle is going to be different. You know, and every artist is going to be different. Some artists like to shade at higher voltages, while others like to shade at lower voltages. You can kind of get the idea behind that. But you can see though that with the same techniques, a different needle is even coming out with smooth shading. Keep in mind, this is a round shader. I never really ever shade with round shaders. But even when I do, we're still able to get clean, consistent strokes here. And reeds. We want those reeds. Those reeds need to be clean. They need to be consistent. And that right there is what a different needle would look like. I'm gonna go ahead and just do maybe one more layer or two. And the same thing right here. And that right there is the results of shading with a different needle. Keep in mind, this is the Josie 7-round shader, but I'm still able to get clean, smooth results. Results that are gonna read well for any viewer, and that's what we want. I'm not getting any blotchiness or anything like that. All right, let me go ahead and clean this up so that way I can give you a top view. Here is a top view at the final Stipple Fundamental Follow Along chart. I went ahead and I outlined everything just to be able to see everything a little bit more clearly, but you can see that there are big differences between consistent strokes versus inconsistent strokes, as well as dot spaced evenly and unevenly. Just off the bat, you can see just unaligning either one of those two variables is going to cause for very inconsistent results. You can see how cross-hatching can tremendously smooth things out as well. You can see in comparison to, for example, the consistent strokes, the cross-hatching is a lot smoother going right and left. This one only has downward strokes. So you can see that there is a bit of a difference there. Cross-hatching does help to smooth things out. And you can also see how important needle introduction is. Again, there's no definitive starting or ending points right here on the needle introduction area. This is also going to be a variable of stipple shading that we want to pick up on and develop early on as well. You can see that even with these techniques, all of them were done with a 3-round liner. Even applying the exact same techniques, just minor adjustments with a 7-round shader, you can see that I'm still able to get clean, consistent stipple results. Feel free to pause this and screenshot it in case you need to reference this later on. That'll be it for this one. I feel like this is a great place to conclude this video. Should you have any questions at all, I encourage you to drop a comment down below. I'm going to do my absolute best to assist you in the best possible direction. Please don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel and ring that bell for me, as I am going to be bringing more videos like this for you all. I also have social medias under the same name as my YouTube. I have Facebook, Instagram, X, and TikTok, all under Daniel Yuck. I would appreciate the support over there as well. With that being said, I thank you for your time and I appreciate you watching. You have a great day.